This is Diana Sullivan in Austin, Texas. Today I want to show how to do mock ribbing at the end of a piece. That is, you begin with knitting on every needle and you finish up with a mock rib hem. Now, we've all learned how to do mock rib at the beginning of a piece. It's in our knitting machine manual. But here's a way to make it at the end of a piece and have it look really nice. This is a 1x1 mock rib. That is, there's a needle out of work in between. And now here is a 2x1 mock rib, which I think looks a little better. You have 2 stitches and then a needle out of work in between. So let's get started. I've knitted a sample and now I'm ready to do the 2x1 mock rib, which means I'm going to have every third needle be out of work. That means I've got to do something with the stitch on that third needle. Your first instinct might be to take the stitch and transfer it over to its neighbor, but I promise you if you do it that way you won't like the way it looks right here where that transfer is. There's a better way to do this. Thread a needle with a contrasting color of yarn and you can sew the stitches onto the thread. That is, put a needle in the loop and draw the thread through and remove the needle. Put the needle all the way back out of work. This is a really simple way to keep these stitches for use later. It's called a lifeline, and we've used this technique before for some other things. With a lifeline, the stitches can't unravel, and it's pretty easy to grab them and do something else with them later. Now typically, when you do a mock rib at the end of the piece, it's for a cuff or a neck, so you would probably want to tighten up the tension. I'm going to do that. My tension was on 2. I'm going to bring it all the way down to 0. Yes, you can use 0. Now I figure out how long I want the hem to be. If I want it to be 10 rows deep because it's double thickness, I have to knit 20 rows. In my case, why don't we make it 8 rows deep and I'll knit 16 rows on the tighter tension with every third needle out of work. Now I pick up my stitches from the lifeline to create a hem. I'm getting that first stitch, which was actually on the edge, and I'm putting it on the right needle of a pair of needles. Then I get the next one, put it on the right of the next pair of needles, and get the next one. And if you have trouble getting it, you can tug on the lifeline to pull the stitch open. And the next one. See me tugging on that lifeline? The stitches tend to shrink up when you're not looking, but this pulls them open again. Next, we have to bring the empty needles into work and put a stitch on them. Now, I'm removing the lifeline. And this is simple. I'm just going to pick one of the loops in between the stitch I got and the next stitch that I picked up and put it on an empty needle. So I just kind of try to get a loop that's horizontal, that's kind of halfway between the other 2 loops I have, and just plunk it on that empty needle. And my last job is to close the hem and bind off. So to close the hem, I do like we always do. I knit 1 row. Now I'm going to go back to my normal tension, which was tension 2, and knit that one last row. And I'm going to bind off using a tapestry needle and the backstitch bind off. Unthread the machine bring the needles out to hold position, bringing the knitting with them. This way the knitting is in the hooks, and a weight is a good idea. Now you're going to cut the yarn, leaving a long tail for binding off. It must be at least 3 times the width of the knitting, and I like to add a little for luck, or just to ensure that I don't run out of yarn before I finish binding off. Now I'll thread the needle, and I'm going to go in the first stitch from front to back and come back out the third stitch from back to front and draw that up. I'm using the fact that this is on the needles to keep me from drawing it up too tightly. Now I'll go in the second stitch. So I've come out here, I'm going back one, that's why it's back stitch, and coming out the next stitch over. I'm skipping one. So in from front to back, out from back to front, and the next one. Go back one, so I came out here, go back here, front to back, and come up from back to front. And now this one, front to back, back to front. This one. I'm keeping my needle above the yarn. It doesn't matter whether you keep your needle below the yarn or above the yarn that's floating across the back. Just be consistent. Now, why am I using this bind off? I'm using this bind off because typically this is a neck or cuff finish and you don't want it to be too tight. This is a very stretchy bind off. I will finish binding that off and show you how this mock rib looks. When my mock rib is finished, I will always take a tool, very often a knitting needle, but for this little sample, one of my transfer tools will work. Put it inside and tug it so that it pulls up and looks more like an actual ribbing. Here's how it looks on the front. Here's how it looks on the back. All of this messiness is that super loose bind off, and you do need that so that it'll go over a neck. Another thing I'd like to point out as I'm playing with this is look how good the base of each of the empty stitch areas looks. It has a stitch behind it that gets used later and it doesn't leave any kind of unsightly hole.